Alright, so this is video 2 for chapter 7. So we just went over the real brief version of the history of schools here in the United States, but I wanted to bring your attention to this fact. We just assume there have always been high schools, and as we said in the last video, that there were more apprenticeships, and only those that could afford could actually go on beyond these dame schools or these grammar schools, right? So really, it wasn't until we see the 1950s on did we have this huge surge of high schools. And so I do think as we look at the issues that face high schools today and the changing nature of them, it's because it is all relatively new. I think we had this huge push for a while of students only getting an academic education, but now you're seeing the pushback to that of all of these career technical institutions that are opening. So again, as John Dewey would say, if we can go backwards and make connections, we can see where we're going forward and not, have those consequences happen, because we're almost going back to that idea of apprenticeships almost with these career and technical education. So I think that's why you'll see a giant shift as you read through education, especially high school education, since the 1600s to now. And especially currently with all of these career and technical institutions and these pathways now taking place. So if you look through 7.2 to 7.5, it will go more in depth on some of these educational milestones. Obviously, there will be many that we are going to talk a lot about, but a couple of things I want to make sure you understand is, we just started taxing for high schools like in 1874, so although they weren't popular, we started using public funding as early as 1874 to start paying for these. Also, another landmark in education is 1896, which was the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision, where segregation became legally sanctioned. So I want to make sure you're aware of that. That was 1896. We still, you would say there's lots of issues still today, but my gosh, that was 1896 and we still haven't, figured everything out. So even in the 19th century, it says, increase education for women and minorities. But we were still segregated at that point as by gender and also by race. But as you know, with Plessy versus Ferguson, it said schools could be separate, but they did have to be equal. But we still know to this day that schools in minority areas still are not getting the same equal resources as others. So that's something that we will continue to talk about. And Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, then happened in 1954, so another landmark that outlawed this racial segregation of schools. But one thing I want to make you aware of, that even though it happened in 1954 and they passed this, if there's no sanctions in place, no punishment, people were not doing it. So it wasn't until much later did we see the Supreme Courts coming in and did we see people coming in to say, hey, this has been passed, this needs to be done in schools, and if not, you will have some federal implications if you don't. But, even in the 1960s, we still had, I guess what you would say is second generation segregation. So all of these students that were given separate but equal education, they were all housed in the same areas. And so to this day, even though we are desegregated, we still see people living in minority or low socioeconomic areas not giving the same education opportunities as others who may be more affluent. So just because it was passed doesn't mean it solved all the problems in one day. And then we see in 1975, IDEA was passed, Education for All Handicapped Children Act. That was renamed IDEA, and so we're going to discuss a lot about that, and we'll especially discuss more about that in Education 2301 for students with the special population students. And then we get to the 21st century. Obviously, the biggest one is going to be passage of No Child Left Behind. So we are going to talk a lot about No Child Left Behind, so make sure that you read the chapter and it just kind of barely skims over because we're going to spend a whole lot more time on it. And then we have federal modifications that have happened recently to No Child Left Behind, which we'll talk about because we will talk about the merits for it, why it was introduced, the need for it, but unfortunately the ramifications that came about afterward. So I want to make sure that you know there were several legislative actions that have taken place to allow for a lot of these things to occur. So even though we were talking about from the 1600s till now, 7.9, the last slide, actually gives you the federal legislation that occurred to make some of these things happen. Another one that we'll talk about is Head Start. And so some people think Head Start is a relatively new concept, but it actually came about in the 1960s. We just have a lot of research about it now and how successful students can be if they start in age 3 in a quality Head Start program. So we will look at Head Start along the way. But again, I just urge you to read Chapter 7. There's just a lot of information about the history of education that you need to have as a foundation to move forward. It also introduces you to John Dewey. And so John Dewey is a controversial figure to some, and to others he is a hero of education, but specifically progressive education. So on page 222, please make sure you read about John Dewey because Chapter 8 will bring up everything, all of the different teaching philosophies, including all of the philosophers or founders of these philosophies, and John Dewey is going to be at the top of that list. So please make sure you read more about John Dewey. And as I said, we will talk about him a lot in Chapter 8. So fun. Make sure you do your reading. It's not a hard read, but it is information that I recommend as you sit down, you're doing your note cards or outlining it along with the information. Now, I'm not going to ask you the specific dates, I like 1823, but I will ask you what was occurring in the 19th century, what was occurring, in the 20th century. I want you to make sure that you're aware of when these things were actually introduced, when this legislation came about, because it'll give you an appreciation of how today, even if legislation is passed, that doesn't mean that it will fix tomorrow. It may fix 3 to 30 years down the road. So I kind of want you to read through these timelines and think about, okay, this legislation occurred, but did this actually happen? So, for example, the Brown versus Board of Education. How long do you think it took to actually implement that to make sure that all entities were following the, governing law? So that is it for Chapter 7. We will review some more of this in class together. I will answer any questions that you may have about Chapter 7 in class on Monday, and then we will move on to Chapter 8. Have a good week.